Hello, welcome to my ACT Prep Resources Workshop, which I presented at the GEAR UP Wyoming Staff Summer Institute on August 5th, later in the morning, I believe. This will be a shortened version of the workshop, which I was supposed to record, but I failed to do so. So I'm going to go ahead and represent it here. It will be a little bit shorter, but I'll do my best to try to give you the full experience. So if you have any questions, I'll provide my contact information at the end, but let's go ahead and get started. So this workshop, again, is meant to talk about some of the tactics that GEAR UP coordinators and coaches can use with students to get them excited about the ACT and prepare them for the ACT. I hope it kind of gets things started for you and inspires you as you start thinking about programming this coming year. First, I'll go ahead and talk about my own personal ACT story. Then we'll go into a brief description of an activity I prepared for the GEAR UP coordinators. Then I'll talk about some of the ACT resources that are available within the GEAR UP program to all of our coordinators around Wyoming. And I will talk about some ideas that I generated in terms of improving buy-in for students, the need for more asset-based language when framing the ACT to students, different ways that you might go about developing a needs assessment to see what your students actually need that they're not getting from their schools or from their teachers or counselors already. And finally, a reminder of some scholarships and college admissions requirements that students might aim for if they are taking the ACT. Just to introduce myself briefly, I'm Alex Rickert. I'm the GEAR UP Wyoming Professional Development and Public Relations Coordinator. My background is in English literature. I have my BAs in English and also the French language from the University of Wyoming. And I also have my MA in English from the University of Wyoming. I did teach briefly between my bachelor degrees and my master's degree in Japan for 3 years. I was an assistant English language teacher, and I taught in Japanese high schools primarily. When I came back to the university for my master's degree, I had the privilege of getting to teach English 1010 to college freshmen for 2 semesters. I was the primary instructor. And then I worked for about 1.5 years at the University of Wyoming Writing Center as a consultant and a coordinator. The Writing Center provides writing tutoring to students, staff, and faculty across the University of Wyoming. So I'm really passionate about language. I also am really passionate about test prep, which is why I volunteered to do this presentation. So I'll go into my ACT story. When I was in high school, I was a free and reduced lunch eligible high schooler. I went to high school at Laramie High School here in Laramie, Wyoming. I wasn't part of the GEAR UP program, though. I was one of those students that just didn't know about it or was overlooked, which is unfortunate because I think I would have really enjoyed it. I took the ACT 2 times in high school. The first time in the spring of 2010, I scored a 29, and the fall of 2011, I scored a 31. And I was really inspired to take the ACT because just by happenstance, I had some friends whose parents were college professors at UW. And they were really privy to a lot of different opportunities for Wyoming students beyond the Hathaway. And so when I was in high school, I learned that the UW Trustee Scholars Award, which is a full ride scholarship to the University of Wyoming, necessitated a high GPA, if not a 4.0, then at least something above a 3.8. And that year, when I took it in 2010, an average of 29 on the ACT. And so I had a really clear goal there. I wanted to talk about, in my personal situation, what made the difference, what allowed me to be passionate about the ACT enough to study and to do relatively well and to get, a really good scholarship that totally changed my life. I wouldn't have been able to pay for UW if I didn't have that scholarship. So for one, it was after school ACT preparatory meetings. So a high school counselor pulled me aside one day and invited me to come to some study sessions after school. And she told me that they were for students who already had high GPAs or who were already academically succeeding. But I suspect this may have been something that was available to all students or that were perhaps even available to low-income students. And maybe she was just framing this in a way to kind of appeal to my ego and to get me more interested by telling me I was a good student. So that was, one really good way, telling the student they have potential rather than they need this because they're lacking something. And then again, for me, I knew I wanted to go to UW and I wanted a good scholarship. And the Hathaway would have been great. And my sister, for example, is going to UW on a Hathaway scholarship. I don't think she's even top tier, and she's still doing, very well. But my parents were really financially struggling at that time. And so I just wasn't counting on getting a lot of support from my parents. And I was really anxious about college. So I really wanted the full ride. And I had the clear goal that I learned about from the Trustee Scholars Award that I needed to get at least the 29 on the test. Some of our students probably wouldn't shoot for such a high score. They might just be shooting for top tier Hathaway or even mid-tier Hathaway. In some cases, maybe even just a minimum score to graduate from high school. I've heard from some GEAR Up advisors that some high schools require minimum scores that are much lower, but you still need to study for. For me, I got a paper book. I think it was the Princeton Review for ACT prep. That was my book. It was given to me. I don't think I had to pay for it. And I really liked it because I could write in it. I could write notes. I had the practice tests, which I don't know if I actually sat down and did a timed practice test before I took it the first time. But I did enjoy just kind of getting to work through all of the questions and kind of understanding what they were going to ask me and what I didn't already know. And then I also retook the test, as I mentioned, and I did improve my score. I boosted it to a 31, which I don't know made a huge difference, but it definitely kind of secured that scholarship for me. There was really, at that point, I had very little doubt that I would get the scholarship. And I actually paid to retake the test. I remember paying the $50, and I paid with my own money. My parents didn't pay. I got it from my part-time job. And it would have been great had I known that I was eligible to retake the test for free. And I would have probably retaken the test a third time had I known that I wouldn't have to pay, because there are even more prestigious scholarships out there that I could have been eligible for had I, boosted my score to a 32 or 33, which, who knows? That could have been something I would have done. So having a waiver is really a game changer, I think, for our students. And that's something we can also stress with them. The next part of this workshop that I prepared were some sample questions for the GEAR Up advisors in my session and the different staff, as well as outreach staff to work through to improve our sense of what the ACT actually asks if we've forgotten. But I'm going to go ahead and skip this part for this online session because it wasn't very popular. And I'm later going to talk about the online platform Magoosh, which provides much better sample questions that you can work with students. Now let's move on to the actual ACT resources that you can use. So just a reminder that the GEAR Up Wyoming grant was written with two objectives that relate to the ACT. GEAR Up Objective 2 has two parts. Part 2A is to improve the proficiency of GEAR Up Wyoming 9th graders on the ACT Aspire Math Subtest. We can show that proficiency by comparing them to other GEAR Up Wyoming eligible non-participants. And I want to emphasize here that it's the math subtest that we're actually focusing on. And that's probably the hardest subtest, I would argue, because it's one where I think you need to have the most prior knowledge going into. So if you have to prioritize studying for the ACT with your students, I would prioritize working on the math subtests with them and letting them work on the other subtests maybe independently if they want to pull up those scores as well. 2B actually tackles the ACT math subtest that all 11th graders are required to take around Wyoming during the spring of their junior year. And again, it's the math subtest. So that's something that even during our workshop, I think a few of us were surprised by. I think we thought it was their general ACT score, or perhaps English and math. And we do talk about English and math in another part of the GEAR Up Wyoming objectives, in terms of we're trying to prevent students when they graduate from having to take remedial math and English classes when they go to college or university. But again, English does not come into play in terms of how we tackle the ACT as a program. And then of course, our objective 7 is a larger percentage of GEAR Up Wyoming 11th graders will take the ACT. So even though it is a requirement, during their junior year that spring, and it is paid for by their schools. A lot of students still don't take it. So our goal, of course, is not just to help them do well on the ACT, especially the math subtest, but to encourage them to take it and try to improve the rates of students who do take it, because just having a score is important. So there are two resources that I wanted to highlight that are available to GEAR Up Wyoming staff. And so one is our new GEAR Up Wyoming statewide curriculum. You can find more information about it in this YouTube playlist. The GEAR Up Wyoming curriculum presentation is also available, so I won't go over it because it's redundant, but the GEAR Up Wyoming curriculum, which was developed by Karen Delbridge, a principal in Cheyenne, and her team of counselors and teachers. They made lots of content for you to work on with students that introduces the ACT, its 4 subtests, and then gives some activities, some lessons, and it also has access to some free practice tests that are available online. You can get that from your coordinator. Again, find more information in this playlist. And then I also wanted to highlight Magoosh. GEAR Up Wyoming has a contract with Magoosh. We can provide Magoosh access to really anybody who wants it. So if you have a student who is interested in practicing for the ACT, please encourage them to enroll in Magoosh with us. A lot of students around the state also have access to a similar online program called Navions. So again, they have lots of options. And so I'll just quickly go through Magoosh. A lot of you probably are already familiar with it, but I really like Magoosh because it allows you to just jump straight in to practice test questions for the 4 subtests. It does provide a lot of overview of the ACT test that you can watch ahead of time, and you can kind of see how much time it takes for each one. So you might, with a student, ask, do you want to learn more about strategies for the reading test? Is that something you're struggling with? And then if you jump right in, you can kind of control how big the test is. Again, it has a lot of content to teach you different concepts that span what you'll be quizzed on in the math subtest, all the way to data interpretation, and then the extra topics like, again, matrices, logarithms, stuff that I myself would need to review if I were going to take this test. Lots of content, but maybe you don't even know what you need to review. This is a lot to go through for students. So of course we encourage them to kind of jump in and take some questions. So you can set it to adaptive difficulty. This means that the difficulty will increase or decrease based on how well they're doing. So if they're not answering a lot of questions correctly, it will go down in difficulty just so that they are getting exposed to stuff they actually can answer, which will encourage them, hopefully. You can limit the number of questions. So if they just want to jump in and do 5 a day or something, they can do that. They can also limit their session based on time, and they can change it to either practice mode, which will show the explanations after each question. So if they get it wrong, it will show them why it was wrong or why it was right. Or they can do quiz mode where they can just try to work through the questions as quickly as possible. And then at the end, they can see how they did and why they did. So let's just do 5 questions. We're not going to actually do them, but I'll show you kind of what pops up. So again, you'll get these all kinds of questions across the ACT. Let's just submit an answer. I'm not even going to read it. We got it wrong, oops, but it shows you your pace. So it can also tell you, if your pace is green, it means you did very well compared to the average pace of the test, which is good. You're trying to get through these questions quickly. It will turn red, of course, if you took too long. I don't think they should over stress this. I think that just getting through the questions is really important. The speed aspect is something they can work on if they want to retake the test. I think just completing the test is important for their first time. It will give you automatic lessons that relate to the content. If you just find out in the explanation, I didn't know that I had to do algebra, which hopefully our students can do algebra, but if they can't, then this will help them, again, create an algebraic equation from the word problem that they can then solve for X. And this will give them more of a sense of how do you translate word problems from the math subtest into equations or into a problem that you can work to solve. So it gives a lot of really relevant strategies for students to work with. So again, I really encourage you to jump straight into Magoosh if you have students who are interested in working on the ACT. Back to our other resources, I also want to emphasize some of the resources that are available on the ACT website. So there is more information here about fee waivers. There are multiple ways that our students can get fee waivers. They're eligible just by being eligible for free and reduced lunch. They would go through their counselor. That's one way. They can ask their counselor for a fee waiver for the ACT, and their counselor can arrange it at their school. But if you're a coordinator and they want to do it through GEAR UP Wyoming, Celeste, she is the person who asks the ACT for fee waivers, and she can distribute across the program as well. And they can receive waivers to retake the test up to 4 times. And that's not including the time that they take the test for free the spring of their junior year. They can only take the test for free during their junior and senior years. But if they wish to take the test in the fall of their junior year for free, they can apply the fee waiver to that. And we want to encourage them to do that because we measure their ACT Math Subtest score when they take it their spring of their junior year. So we're hoping that they would take it hopefully in the fall beforehand. One other thing that actually was pointed out to me that one advisor did not know is that students who do not use English as their first language, of which we have several in the GEAR UP Wyoming program, many of whom are Spanish speaking, they are entitled to accommodations on the ACT. But it's something that they have to ask for. But I wanted to highlight that it is available, and just reemphasizing that the accommodations that are available, they are allowed up to 50% time extension, so they can have more time to read the problems and to work on them. They are entitled to a bilingual word-to-word dictionary. This dictionary has to be a special approved dictionary because it can't contain too many definitions. Otherwise, I think it gives them too much of an advantage on the English subtest. And then they're entitled to an ACT test that's written in currently 12 different languages. Spanish is definitely one of them. So they are entitled to accommodations for the ACT. So I want you guys all to remember that. And then the ACT itself, like ACT.org, provides free practice resources in Spanish as well. They provide a complete free online practice test, and they also provide like lessons. So there's a lot of free resources out there that are given by ACT.org that students can use if they don't want to work with you, or if they don't want to use Navions provided by their school. So really, there's just an abundance of resources for students to use, and they can explore them, or you can explore them with them to see what suits them the best. So if you also have other resources you want me to highlight for next time, go ahead and reach out to me. Again, I'll provide my email and contact information. Finally, I wanted to briefly talk about some thoughts that I had in terms of how we can frame the ACT to our students to improve their buy-in of the test. One is I wanted to emphasize using asset-based language when talking about the ACT. So the goal here is to do 2 things: not to scare students from taking the ACT, because that ultimately will have a negative impact on their performance. If we tell them things like low-income students don't do as well on the ACT, or it's just designed to be hard, we run into the fear of stereotype threat, where students will think that because their demographics don't do as well on the test, that they won't do well, and that the stereotype will perpetuate itself just by that anxiety. So we want to make sure that we're framing things in terms of, rather than the ACT is designed to trick you, it requires critical thinking skills, which you already have. All of our students are critical thinkers and they already have that skill. It's just a muscle that they might need to develop. Rather than accentuating consequences for doing poorly, so not getting funding for college or not graduating from high school, we should always be emphasizing the rewards that they can be eligible for doing well on the ACT. So again, Hathaway scholarships, easy college admission, potential full ride scholarships if you do very well. And we'll talk more about those requirements for different scholarships later. And then many of us have thoughts about the ACT and if it's actually a good measure of real world skills or real world intelligence. But I do want to emphasize that the ACT it does measure certain concepts that you should have learned from your time in high school and that will be useful to you during college. So having a basic sense of English grammar and punctuation, understanding math concepts up to logarithms, being able to read technical information in the science subtest. And then of course, in the reading subtest, being able to kind of work with larger passages and be able to extract information from those passages to perform tasks. In this case, just to answer questions, but in college, it would be, to pull citations or to synthesize concepts. Those are all going to be useful for you in college. So we really want to emphasize the skills that the ACT is testing and hopefully emphasizing in them rather than its shortcomings in measuring real world intelligence. Because of course we have other things we need to do as adults that the ACT does not measure, but that's not necessarily relevant to college access. And the fact is they have to take it. So we need to stress the positives. So I gave a short activity on ways that we can rephrase deficit-based language when talking about the ACT. So rather than saying it's nearly impossible to get above a 33 on the ACT, I think we should emphasize that it is possible. It is. Even if they have a small chance, there's still a chance. And of course, they can improve that chance by studying, but you never know until you try. We might think about the fact that the ACT is not equitable or that it's really hard for students whose first language isn't English. But again, as we saw, they have accommodations to make that test a little bit more manageable. So stressing that. And then of course, taking the ACT can be a stressful, high pressure situation. It's very time-based. You have to move really quickly, but instead stressing that throughout your life, you're going to be in situations where you're in a time crunch and you need to kind of move through things quickly. And the ACT is not about answering every question correctly. And it's not about being perfect. It's about getting through it. It really kind of helps you adapt to that stress because stress is going to be a part of our lives. It's not something we can really avoid or that we should avoid. It's a natural, healthy part of being a human. Of course, we don't want to overstress ourselves, and that's really important as well. But I think the ACT is an appropriate level of stress for most of our students, and it's a good training tool for them for academic exercises to come. There's another thing I wanted to emphasize that students may be getting a lot of information about the ACT from other sources. So as you are all probably doing, always speak with your student about what they might need. Doing Magoosh is a really good way if students don't know what they don't know, as I mentioned earlier, if they don't know that they're behind in certain math concepts, or if they don't know that their understanding of English grammar might not be totally aligned with the ACT test. Magoosh is a great way to diagnose those areas where they need more study. Next, I wanted to emphasize the different scholarships that are available. These are not all of them by any means. There are a lot that come up that we've never heard about, and a lot of programs that emphasize different ones. So of course, for Hathaway, the minimum score to receive funding through the Hathaway is a 17. That's for the provisional Hathaway. And then 18 is for that first tier. And then honors Hathaway, of course, is a 25. So students can kind of pick, what are they kind of aiming for? I wanted to emphasize, I'm a big advocate for the Trustee Scholars Award because I was a recipient and because it really did make a huge impact on my life. So if you are interested in advertising the Trustee Scholars Award to your student, I checked, and like last year, the average ACT score for Trustee Scholar recipients was a 32. So it has climbed up quite a bit since I took it 10 years ago. But again, if your student took it and got like a 30, they should be shooting then for the 32. So if they're somewhere within this like 5-point range, that's a huge possibility for them. And then there are other scholarships like the Presidential Scholars Program or the Daniels Fund that don't have super clear ACT requirements. For example, the Daniels Fund only says 18 on their website, but of course having higher scores helps. So that's something that students can, again, shoot for in terms of getting the highest score they can with a good GPA. And you can evaluate every year as it changes. And then in terms of admissions, of course, having a higher score will help students stand out among applicants. And then doing well on the ACT Math Subtest, I think a 25 will help them place out of certain math classes if they're not going into a math-based major. There were a few other things that came up during the discussion, which I'll briefly highlight. The ACT Super Score allows students to focus on different subtests when they take the ACT. They don't have to do well across the board to boost their score. They can go in just focusing on the English if they need to boost their English and so on. And yeah, that's all I can remember from our discussion. So if you have any other thoughts or resources that you'd like to discuss with me, you can go ahead and reach out to me. My email address is arickert, ARICKERT @uwyo.edu. Thank you so much for joining me, and I hope that our students do well on the ACT this year.